Okay, unless you've been in a coma, by the time you hear this podcast, you will already know that the Supreme Court voted 9-0 to allow Trump to remain on the ballot. So, why am I putting this episode out? Not that it's going to be terribly long. I'm putting it out as an I told you so. You don't have to go back too many episodes to hear me saying the Supreme Court is going to punt on this one. And there were all these people who were citing all the arguments being made by the people wanting Trump off the ballot that said, no, here's proof. This is, they're going to use these arguments and they're going to convince the Supreme Court with these arguments because these arguments were made by the justices presently on the court or previous justices that the current ones look up to back up the idea that Trump was an insurrectionist and should not be on the ballot. And as all of you know, that's not what happened. The Supreme Court threw it out, said, no, we don't give a shit. And if you dig into the ruling, you find out that it wasn't actually 9-0 in the sense that they all really agreed with it. There were a couple of justices who were like, nah, well, we agree that he should be on the ballot. We think that it shouldn't be, for the reasons exactly given, and we take issue with that, but we still think he should be on the ballot. And so I'm putting this out not as an I told you so much as I am to give you an understanding that no one else is going to be talking about. And if they are, they're going to be using really heated, nasty language that's going to potentially turn people off. And I am not going to use heated and nasty language. I am not making an argument from emotion on this. I am going to point you to sort of a historical parallel to all of this. Okay, now, you have, regardless of what you've heard, people say about this Supreme Court decision, you've heard me talk about and complain about what I've called wine moms in the local Democratic Party. And people like, quote-unquote, wine moms exist in every political party. And these are people who agree with a particular party's values, but they don't, if their party loses, they don't suffer any consequences. So they may not be happy with the outcome of an election, but they don't see it as a serious issue. Now, if you're somebody who, say, is at risk of becoming pregnant, if prior to the 2016 election you didn't see how Trump getting elected could possibly harm you, I think you got that message after the Dobbs decision, and if you didn't, you certainly should have gotten it here recently with that IVF decision in Alabama. And I'm not saying that people did not fight against Trump, did not fight against the Dobbs decision. They absolutely did. But there are a whole lot of people in, the Democratic Party and even in the Republican Party who just didn't see Trump being elected as a serious issue. Again, if you've been listening to this podcast since November 2016, You know that I have said this is really fucking bad that Trump has won, and we have to be careful or we could really, really be fucked. And I'm not going to say that the quote-unquote wine moms could have fought harder than they did. I don't know for certain. Some of them almost certainly could have, but the group as a whole, don't know. But it is symbolic of the people who just have a vague interest in politics and they don't focus on it. They think that, yes, it may be bad if this or that person wins, but things will just be a little bumpy for a while until somebody else gets in there and then it'll all be fine. No, that's not what happens when we're dealing with individuals like Trump. However, the Supreme Court justices, all of them, are like wine moms. They don't think about the kinds of impacts that their decisions can have on people. They're so disconnected from it. And even when the Supreme Court knows for a fact that innocent people will die, they don't necessarily care. I'm not going to say that all of them don't care or anything like that, but all you have to do is look up the case of Cameron Todd Willingham, or just go to the innocentproject.org's website and look at the history of people in the 21st century, folks, okay? We're not talking the 1900s or the 1800s. We're talking since 2001 until today. The Supreme Court has had ample evidence that an individual was innocent, but said, no, go ahead and kill him. And some of the evidence in the cases where the Supreme Court has been like, yeah, go ahead and kill that fucker, should have been enough to exonerate the person, if not at least get the Supreme Court to say, we want this delayed, we want a new trial, we want this, we want that, because if we're going to snuff this asshole out, we want to make sure that he actually did what he's accused of. They didn't do it. It is the nature of institutional structures, the way they are shaped, that has led to this. And this is a parallel that I want to talk about. If you dig into Chinese history, particularly when the royal dynasty in China collapsed, and then, you had the communists come into power. One of the things that you will find out is that the Chinese, who were one of the first nations to do something that has actually been adopted by multiple nations, and in some ways rightly so, because for centuries China had civil service exams. So if you wanted to be a government employee, say you you wanted to work in the customs house, or you wanted to be a tax assessor or whatever, you couldn't get that job because you bribed somebody or because you were related to somebody. You had to take a test. And if you passed that test, you could get that job. Now, obviously, you might have to bribe somebody after you pass the test, but if you didn't pass that fucking test, you weren't getting to a point where you could bribe somebody. or your family name got you that gig. You had to, that test was sort of the great leveler. And one of the things you find out when you study 18th and 19th century history in Europe is that a lot of the military leaders and a lot of government officials got their jobs simply because they could bribe somebody or they were related to somebody, so they got the cushy government job with the guaranteed paycheck. But when the British began forcing their way into China, even though they did not consider the Chinese to be their equals, they did like the idea of civil service exams and putting people in positions of authority based on abilities and not merely the name or, the fact that they could bribe somebody. It took all the way up until after World War II for that to fully flow through the entire British government, but it did eventually happen. And I only mention British because I'm more familiar with that history, and U.S. history was somewhat the same, although we were more merit-based than were the British, obviously, because we did not have royalty. Still, family names did play a part into it. Like a lot of Robert E. Lee got where he got because, his dad was pals with George Washington. And the whole legacy admission thing at the various Ivy League universities is a continuation of the whole, well, you're royal blood or noble blood, so obviously we have to let you in. Doesn't matter if you're drooling idiot. Because your parents were also cousins, we're gonna let you in, and it doesn't matter what you're you don't have to take any tests to get in here. You just come on in. Right? So, the big difference between the civil service exams that the British adopted, and then, Europe and the United States adopted, and the Chinese civil service exams, is that the Chinese had basically one civil service exam for every position. And it didn't matter what job you were going for, you just had to pass this one test that was identical to the test that, somebody going for a position that's in an entirely different area than yours had to pass. So it didn't matter if you were you were going to be a tax collector or you were going to be a government engineer. You both had to pass an identical civil service exam test. And that test was on Confucianism. And over the centuries, because, government jobs in a country like China and lots of other places were so desirable that you began to see educational programs that taught to the test. So people didn't learn other skills. They just learned how to pass the civil service exam. So you got somebody who was a tax collector or, a government engineer or a government health worker. And yes, they did have such things. Who got that job not because they had a skill in whatever field they were going in, but simply because they knew Confucianism. And, the tests had to become harder and harder in order to ensure that they weren't overwhelmed with candidates. So you had to spend more and more of your time studying Confucianism and less of your time studying, say, agriculture, if you were going to be the agriculture, going to work in the Department of Agriculture, or, whatever you might need to know to be a postal worker or whatever. So by the time the last dynasty fell in the early 20th century, the people running the government, the bulk of them, didn't know what they were supposed to be doing in that particular position, but they knew everything you could possibly imagine about Confucianism. And when it comes to not merely the Supreme Court, but a lot of high-level government positions, whether they're elected or appointed or, quote-unquote merit-based, we're in the same situation. We have lots and lots of people who have positions of authority, and the only reason they got there is not because they're skilled at what that position calls for, but because they're skilled at getting into that position. And I'm not going to shit on the qualifications of many of the Supreme Court justices, because several of them are very highly qualified. They've spent time as prosecutors or defense attorneys, and judges and things like that before they ever were appointed to the Supreme Court. But all of them are insulated from the consequences of their decisions by their wealth and their power. And that's a bit of a problem because I'm sure that a number of the justices are like, well, it doesn't really matter if Trump's on the ballot or not because he's not going to win. And even if he does, he can't really do a lot of damage. Again, Dobbs' decision as far as the damage, and a whole lot of people never thought Trump would win the primary in 2016, and sure as shit he did, and then he fucking won the election, all because of the Electoral College. So, really need to get our shit together, and we really need to start thinking about, let's not isolate the judges the way we have been doing. Let's get, we got to do something so that the default is when, hey, there's a lot of evidence this guy is innocent and we're still planning on executing him, the Supreme Court doesn't say, yeah, okay, let's just go ahead and kill this guy. It needs to be the reverse. It needs to be overwhelming evidence, not merely beyond reasonable doubt, but beyond all doubt that a person committed a crime before we execute them. And I will have a link to this in the description for this episode. You will want to check out, and this is what made me remember all this stuff about Chinese history. It made me think, probably ought to do something, say something. There is a podcast I listen to called Lions Led by Donkeys, and it is a military history podcast where they talk about, really stupid decisions in military history. So, things like Custer's Last Stand, where it was like, dude, what the fuck are you doing? You're attacking these people for no legitimate reason, and now you and just about everybody is dead on your side. Go fuck yourself. So it's stuff like that. And they just started a series. I've only heard the first episode because that's all they've put out. And that's really all you need to hear to get what I'm going for with this. But they're doing an episode of the Boxer Rebellion. If you're not familiar with the Boxer Rebellion, basically, in the late 18th or 19th century, China was, starting to decay because of really bad government shit, which they talk a little bit about, but not quite as much as I just did. And if you're not familiar with the Boxer Rebellion, I can give you a real quick rundown. Late 19th century, basically, China was being fucked over by various Western nations and Japan, to some extent, as well as a few other countries. And as a result of this, there were all these paramilitary organizations that sprung up in China that had these crazy religious views. And the Empress Dowager, who was running China at the time, said, yeah, I like these folks because they're against the Europeans. And let's face it, the Europeans were shitheads. As were the Americans and a couple other groups that were, fucking over the Chinese. And, well, I mean, I'm listening to this and I took some Chinese history classes in college, so I was very, I was familiar with the Boxer Rebellion, but I'm listening to this stuff and I'm like, wow, a whole lot of this shit sounds like the modern day United States, only instead of an Empress Dowager being supportive of these whacked out religious militias, it's Trump. So, like I said, first episode definitely worth listening to. Haven't heard the others, so I can't comment on them. But this episode, yeah, you're gonna want to listen to, because as they say, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. And this one is rhyming really, really fucking hard. All right, I'm going to get out of here, and I will talk to you later on this week. Take care, everybody.